and dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Good evening and welcome to the Story of Liberty. I'm your host, John Bona, and with me is Marshall and Dan. You probably know these guys by now, Dr. Marshall Foster and theologian Dan Williamson. Say good evening, guys.
Good evening, John. Hey, great to be back.
Good to be with you as well. You know, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. I thought of that as we were listening to that great clip from Braveheart. And, going back a little bit, Marshall, and back in your day, one of the world's finest news commentators, and probably in your opinion as well, mine, Paul Harvey. He told a story once that a pastor repeated that I heard, and he told us of an experimental chimpanzee, which scientists were determined to teach how to speak. I don't know if you heard this story. They've been working with the animal for 14 years. And the project directors, they really labored patiently with the chimp until it had mastered about 140 signs, which when put together form words. And finally the day arrived when it seemed the chimpanzee was actually going to say something. And the word went out to all the scientists in this complex. And they all crowded into this room and gathered around the cage. And they watched with great expectation as the chimp made these symbols that seemed to be formed into words and then a sentence. And at last, the first message from a non-human, from the world's most pampered, most cared for, most patiently trained, best-fed chimp on the planet was about to come forth. And the scientists, as Paul Harvey told the story, they could hardly contain themselves. And they pressed around the cage to read this history-making sentence. And finally, the chimpanzee said, "Let me out of here." You see, all the training, all the pampering, all the feeding doesn't mean a thing as long as there's no liberty. No freedom. And that's what we're going to...
wisdom there, John, that most people have in the budget committees today.
There's a great deal to say about liberty. In fact, as we'll talk about in part tonight, it's one of the major themes of Scripture. And as you remember, the Old Testament people, they went down to Egypt and they became enslaved for over 400 years. And finally, they were delivered back into their own land. And then years later, because of sin, their sin, they were taken captive to Babylon again for another 70 years of enchainment and imprisonment and lack of liberty. But as we opened the program, we said that Christ said in his very first message that he came to set the prisoners free and to proclaim liberty. He really is the great emancipator. And the Bible makes it clear, unless there's personal liberty and emancipation, there will not be civic or national freedom either. And that being said, we have to ask the question, why are so many nations living in poverty without liberty? And I've been told, and I've checked it out, that about almost half of the world, a little less than half of the world's population, lives in some degree of poverty. Why? And I think through my research and the people I've talked to, the primary reason that nations are in poverty is a lack of, let's say, spiritual resources, the Christian faith, truth. For example, I'll give you an example. India is a good example how a people's religion directly affects its economic prosperity. Now, today, as in the past, India has widespread hunger problems. It's not due to a lack of food. It's a result of the people's religious beliefs. The facts are the major religion in India is Hindu. And the Hindu religion teaches that people who die are reincarnated as animals. Therefore, their laws and their religion prohibit people from eating animals, cows, even mice, and of course they're not going to eat them, but their laws prohibit them from killing them and other animals. Now, there are about 200 million sacred cows in India. Each cow eats enough food to feed 7 people. Now, you do the math. The feed from these cows alone would feed about 1.5 billion people. And that's about a quarter of the world's population today. Now, the mice and the rats, which they're not allowed to kill either, they eat much of the grain. And the grain, not to mention the meat from the cows, and we haven't even talked about that, would supply plenty of food for all the starving people of India. And that's my point, that the economic state of a nation depends upon its religion. Now, Dan, let me ask you, I mean, do you foresee that the Christian religion as the only faith that could bring true liberty and prosperity to America?
Well, if I study the paper trail, as Marshall would put it so eloquently, of history, what we see is any place where a nation or a civilization establishes even some of the simplest biblical principles, they prosper. One of the great civilizations, which it seems like no one even talks about anymore, is the Byzantine Empire. It lasted from 395 after Christ's birth to 1453, where it finally fell to the Desert Scourge. But for 1,000 years, it stood as a civilized nation in a barbaric world, holding the barbarians to the north at bay, holding the barbarians coming from the south at bay. And it's really interesting to think about 4 key principles they built the nation upon. One was a good money supply, no dross in the money, good gold and silver coinage. 2, food was the cornerstone of their economy. Yes, they were located on the Bosporus and were a great commerce city, but food was safe and secure and was one of the main trading items. 3, a strong military, a defensive military. They were always trying to kind of defend their borders against all these barbaric enemies, and they had a strong military, and it protected them. They were not an outward attacking army, but a defending army. And last but not least, they took that biblical principle that anybody could be king or emperor. There's one story of a baker that became the emperor of the city. And that city then prospered, having some golden years and some years that were a little more difficult. But this empire lasted 1,000 years, and we don't even hardly talk about it in our history books. But it was based on those biblical principles: no dross in the money, it shall be for food. All men were equal and could become the king. Anybody had the opportunity. Last but not least, they in theory hoed the horses. They weren't an offensive military. They were a defensive military, and a good one, a strong one built of the people. So, we have examples out there of taking biblical principles and building empires that lasted a very, very long time. And obviously that march in history has made for better empires than maybe the Byzantium one was. They weren't perfect, but we really see the culmination of this paper trail of liberty as we approach the American Republic in 1776.
Very interesting. Go ahead, Marshall.
Well, the story of liberty just marches, and that's really the title of our radio show for a reason, and that is that the story of liberty is not just a chance event. America just didn't pop out of the wilderness and come up with the greatest constitutional republic the world's ever known and help to liberate 1 billion people from tyranny. With 102 simple yeomen and farmers from England who come across the ocean with no money, no power, no influence, nothing going for them except the truth and the Bible, and they change a continent, they change a world to this day, 400 years later, where still America rules and reigns over the world in terms of its philosophy and worldview, people still long to come to the land of the free and the home of the brave, even though in some ways we're not so brave anymore and we're not quite so free because we've forgotten our roots. But the truth of that story, the greatness of this liberation of the mankind from 5,000 years of tyranny, the contrast is just not understood by most people. Most people think most people have lived in freedom. They've enjoyed what we've enjoyed. I mean, we go get a latte or take our kids out for ice cream, and we take it for granted. The vast majority of people that have ever lived, vast majority, have never had freedom, never had liberty, never had property, never been able to go wherever they wanted to go, or marry who they married, or have the religion that they wanted. It was all determined for them by a small minority who raped, pillaged, and took everything they had. And that was true of the Greeks and of the Romans and the Egyptians. It was true of the barbarians from Germany. It was true of the Aztecs and the Incas and the Chinese emperors and the Japanese warlords. Wherever you go in the world, it was a top-down, small group take over life until Christ's word, the liberating word, came and taught these biblical principles that all men are created equal, that there is no partiality with God, and that each one of us is created in the image of God. And so the human being is sacred. You can't just kill somebody without due process, without having a trial. And it goes on and on. The biblical laws and principles that are built into the words of Scripture have exploded upon the world in the last 4 centuries because the Bible was only slowly unleashed after the time of Christ, because sooner rather than later it became locked into Latin, and the vast majority of people weren't able to read it. In the 16th century, it was translated into the language of the people, especially in the English language. You see that happening in England and Scotland and over to America, and they took that as their handbook for liberty. And so you have the common man reading this book that tells them that God is sovereign, not the king. The king can't rape and pillage you. If he does, he no longer should be king. And so the people began to reason and think, and finally England and especially America then went to take these principles and apply them, and we end up with the miracle of America. It is a Christian miracle, and every historian practically through this was not even a question that America was a Christian nation founded on Christian principles. In fact, just to give you the statistics of that, 99.5% of the people in 1776, 99.8% were professing Christians. 98.4% of them were Protestant, 1.4% of them were Roman Catholic. So all but 0.2% considered themselves believing Christians. And Benjamin Franklin said, you can go anywhere in America without ever in your lifetime meeting an atheist or an infidel. And, he went on and talked about the amazing way in which this Christian nation was built. And Benjamin Franklin's not known as the best Christian in America himself, but that's what America has.
And isn't that Marshall, you did the foreword on the Geneva Bible, which was recently reprinted, and isn't that the power of the press invented by Gutenberg in 1439, which eventually made the Bible available, and then the translators putting it in English so that a father could sit with a Geneva Bible with the footnotes at the bottom and actually could be the priest of his own family and begin to teach his own children, and then put that liberty man in their hearts so that you're carrying that liberty with you everywhere you go. It's not just something that's a piece of paper that here I have this authority, but that authority is actually in you because you self-govern. Isn't that the power that once the press was built, and then it could print multiple Bible copies, and then it's translated in English, and that just moves out through families from the bottom up to really change the world?
Yeah. That's the spirit of liberty. And that spirit of liberty through what we call Freedom Man or Liberty Man. Ronald Reagan in his farewell address said, what we need are freedom men like John Winthrop, who came over on the Arabella with the Puritans in 1630 and said that we should build a city on a hill based upon God's word. And he was saying that that's what we've forgotten to teach our children is the story of the Liberty Man or the Freedom Man. Who is that? That's a person with internal character that has been trained in the way the world works. And how does the world work? It's determined by what God says in his word. He's the man who created it. He authored it. He has the recipe for liberty. wants people to be free. All we got to do is read the instruction book. And so for those who read it and then take it in and digest it and teach their children, generations of liberty will then spread not only to their nation, but as they spread it out, they'll spread it to the rest of the world. And that's what happened in the 19th century. Because of missionaries, basically we have the spreading of Christianity, and a degree of liberty began to spread to nations that had never before even dreamed of freedom and liberty. And India is a good example of having a democracy today that is still there. And of course, the English had a great influence upon them in many ways. And they had come over as missionaries and then left behind English common law and some things that have benefited them, even though they haven't certainly taken it all the way, because they have not taken Christianity in its full sense. Most of them haven't.
Marshall, these
good days can lie ahead if we'll simply go back and remember this understanding of freedom, and if we would teach our children this stuff, which most people don't know how to do because they don't know the story.
Marshall, yeah, these principles of God-given liberty, the principles of Christian economics, if you will, that really in a Christian economy, if there is such a thing anymore, we pray that there is, that, as you said, under God's law and Christian stewardship in this economy would be a great challenge, because the first thing I think of is to play this out in an economy and business, that men would first respect each other's property. Look at, in many nations today, and even America, we have dozens of locks on, doors, walls, fences, houses, businesses. And, you wonder the basic concept of not stealing or cheating one another. That's a basic Christian concept of stewardship. And to abide by a contract. You make a contract in business, you abide by it. And I think those are all really important things that Christians need to remember, and actually playing this out for the growth of an economy. And also, when people are elected or appointed to positions in government, that they don't use their power to erode the value of people's money through inflation, for example, or excessive regulation. I read an article about a Christian businessman in a developing country who needed to get some raw materials through customs so he could, fill a large order for various different customers. And he needed 46 different signatures of government officials. And most of these officials wanted a bribe. And he wouldn't do it. He just wouldn't give the money. And it delayed his materials from being delivered. And it cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, we see that when there's excessive regulation and dishonesty, people are dishonest, that stifles economic growth. And I don't know who said it. To quote a phrase, I can't remember who said it, but it was a great principle, I thought. He said, people need to work all they can, earn all they can, and save all they can, and give all they can. Those are 4 basic good principles. What it is, Dan?
Wesley.
Yep.
Who said that? Yeah. That's right. And, Ronald Reagan made a great statement concerning that. He said there's only 300 and something words, he said, in the 10 Commandments, which we can basically build a civilization on. He said there are 2,800 words in the book on how to pick cabbage in the agriculture department. He said there's so many regulations in the government that it is stifling business, and you've experienced that. I'm sure, John, in your business, that there are $1.25 trillion spent every year in simply defending your business from the regulations of the federal, state, and local government, which is more than all the profits made by all the businesses in America. So more than their profit margin they have to spend trying to work their way through the regulations just to get a business started.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and that's what we'll talk about as we go into the second half of this program, the free market. And what you just said, Marshall, how what our country has developed into so many rules and regulations that it really goes against the Bible's teaching on the role of government that gives support to the idea of a free market rather than socialism. And because there's nothing in the Bible's teaching on the role of government which would give the government or warrant the government to take over ownership or control of private business. And that's what happens with all these regulations and additional taxes and control against private enterprise. It makes it very difficult, like you said, to focus on being productive when you constantly have to worry about forms you have to file and deadlines you have to meet and the enormous amount of paperwork required in all that. And that's what I'd like to spend the second half of the program, if we can, talking about, what the several factors that support the idea of free markets, what that really means. And, of course, the Bible's view of government that would demand that politicians take responsibility for this problem today, no matter who created it. And, of course, this applies to the value of money, etc. Dan?
And John, what we're talking about here, and I think it's important for our audience to understand, is something so fundamental. It goes far beyond politics, because both parties have really blown a federal government that happened under both parties. What happened is something so unbiblical, so against the laws of nature and nature's God, that the Founding Fathers wouldn't even recognize America today, because they built their nation upon biblical standards and laws that they considered to be inalienable. You don't change those principles. The problem so much today is that things have been divided into political discussions so that it's just a matter of your opinion. People in America need to stop having opinions and have their ideas built upon what George Washington called the eternal rules of right. What is right and wrong? It's wrong to steal another man's property. It is wrong to not work hard. It's wrong to steal from your employer. It's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. And there's certain things that are wrong and there's certain things that are right, and they don't change. No matter what generation you live in, no matter what country you live in, these are principles you're willing to die for. And that's why in the Braveheart, we love that story at the beginning where he says, wouldn't you give up everything to come back here and tell your enemies that you can take our lives, but you won't take our freedom? That was to him an inalienable right. You cannot take away my freedom.
Exactly.
And so we've got to get beyond these ideas, well, I just have an opinion, and so I'm going to vote for the guy.
I think that was Marshall checking out there.
Okay, well, we're going to break away anyway in a minute, and we'll be back with the Story of Liberty. Welcome back to the Story of Liberty. I'm John Bona, your host, with Marshall and Dan, Marshall Foster and Dan Williamson. We're talking about the principles of Christian economics, if you will. And, of course, the Bible's teaching on the role of government gives support to the idea of a free market rather than socialism. And, of course, to give an example, is taxation. The Bible gives repeated warnings against a ruler or government that would use its power to take what wrongfully belongs to the people, including their fields, their farms, whatever it was back then, and today, as it relates to private property. And you might be shocked to hear, folks that are listening, joining us tonight, that even the property tax, that the civil government in the United States, it's in direct violation of biblical law. Because private property should be owned by people, and all this land in our country, in a sense, is rented by the citizens from the government. If you don't pay your property tax, your rent, you'll be evicted. That is theft. The government has no right whatsoever to tax property. And the principle of eminent domain is almost like a claim to deity, that some higher authority could come in and just take your land. And that is also specifically forbidden in Scripture. Now, Marshall, I know you know a lot about this. You've taught this for over 30 years in your research as a Christian historian, that the Bible's emphasis on the value of human liberty and in this free market that we're talking about. And to me, you know, free market is a wonderful process. It's a God-given process. And in human societies where the goods and services that are produced by a society, that's the supply, they continually adjust and match the goods and services that are wanted by the society. That's called demand. And it's so interesting how it works that each period of time through which a society assigns a measurable value to each good and service at that period in time, that the free market choice of the individual person in that society, rather than the government, could go ahead and acquire it. And so my point is that a free market, it can be seen in several different ways, but it's a lot better than government control or the government producing goods and services. The economic goods that a free market produces, look at the quality of the free market production we have in the United States. Lower prices, goods that people actually want. And I think this is a great concept, Marshall. And I know before the break we were talking about, you were in Berlin, in East and West Berlin, and you've seen the West Berlin, the prosperous, energetic, the bright economy there that prospered when you went there. But as soon as you crossed over that Berlin Wall, you entered that gloomy world of gray buildings and empty streets and colorless shops, which had little to offer the East German people. That was drained out of the city. They were trapped in this poverty, and that's why people should remember this. That's why they had to build the Berlin Wall. To keep the people from leaving East Berlin. See, their economy was not biblically based. What was the difference? I would ask you, Marshall, what was the difference in the economic system? Both halves of the city were filled with German people. They had the same ethnic and cultural, linguistic background. But the truth is, one half had fallen under communist control at the end of World War II, and the other half remained free under biblical principles in their economy. Marshall,
right. 1/3 of Germany, not just Berlin, but 1/3 of Germany, of course, was under communist control, and they built that wall in 1960, and it went up and it stayed up for almost 30 years, and it's satanic, is what it is, and it goes back to Stalin, who killed millions of his own people, starving them to death, putting all of the peasants of Russia in communal farms and taking them off of their farms. This gets back down to private ownership again. If people do not have private ownership and land throughout the history of the Bible, beginning with the children of Israel who were given plots of land, and every tribe and every individual community each person was to own his own land and work his own crops. That is the way in which society works best, is when men own their own things. If you take away the farmer's little piece of land that he was working on, and you're a peasant in the Ukraine, then you starve to death under these communal farms, and that's what happened. That's what happened in East Germany. So when you go over there and see it, it's like there is no paint on the walls. They were driving paper mache cars, only one car you could get, and the car, if you got in an accident, you died. That's how it was made. It wasn't even made with metal because they couldn't get any metal working going in East Germany. It was just communism does not work. But the sad thing is, let's look at America. We are becoming communistic right now in the way our government is working. They are now taking over the land of America and destroying private enterprise through regulation and control. 60% of the west of the Mississippi in America is owned by the federal government by fiat. They didn't buy that land or take it away from private parties. They simply own that land, and they won't sell it to private private owners. They won't. We could solve our national debt problem by simply putting up the federal lands that are available west of the Mississippi, 60-70% of the land, and sell it off to private individuals. Imagine the productivity of these individuals if they would use that land and make it productive in all kinds of ways. So we're just simply breaking God's law, and we're heading towards Stalin's Russia. That's where we're heading towards.
When we talk about this, one of the things we have to keep in mind is God gave Adam a task, and his task was to take toward the land. And there's two things implied there. Number one, who owns all the land? God does. The earth is his footstool. And then on top of it, who did he assign the task? It was to the family, Adam and Eve. So when we look at the cycle of land, we should understand it as God owns it all. Man, woman, family, or something like that, okay, it could be an individual person too, owns the piece of land and is steward of it. And, well, of course, what is the whole chief end of man is to glorify God. So everything we're trying to do is a cycle that leads right back to glorifying God. When the government can reach in, or any entity can reach in, and either tax or drive us from our land, well, then who owns it? If we're leasing and renting it, then comes the attribute that, well, now it's no longer land that's God's, it's been surrendered. And then the next thing that happens is when that surrender begins to occur, and then we put debt on that land, or usury, which is not a biblical way of operating. That's a Babylonian way of operating, debt on land. Then we begin to become enslaved, because then we have two masters we are serving. One, we're trying to serve God and take dominion, and two, we're having to serve this master that needs a payment every month, whether it be a righteous or unrighteous in terms of the amount. And yet in the Old Testament, debt was only supposed to be for a couple things, and it was not supposed to have interest. See, the law said that if somebody got into a family life crisis, and we use the example, a child becomes very ill, or if they had to go to war to defend, or a crop failure, there is some mercy there to provide finances in a debt situation, but it had to be paid back quickly. You weren't to be in debt long because you were enslaved. The Babylonian system introduced which they talk about in the Old Testament, even they reference it in Revelations 18:2 and 4, talks about a usury system where you have high interest rates and you have debt on everything, meaning just because I want something fun, I take a debt. Well, as we've moved into a consumer economy, we've incurred debt just for fun, for all practical purposes, instead of being a producer with little to no debt except in a crisis, and then the crisis is even surrendered based on the Sabbath years up to the year of Jubilee when everything is turned back. I mean, God had a system to get everybody out of that situation and back under, how should we say it, pure worship and glorification of God, not being caught in slavery and having a dual purpose. These are all knotted together, and this is America's struggle today. We've taken on a consumer debt cycle system, which is how our current Federal Reserve System works. We're based on debt, and we're based on consuming instead of producing and owning, and then we don't have this dual purpose. We're trying to serve two masters, God the state and God the real God, which would be Jehovah.
Recently, too, we've heard comments made from the White House again that remarks that it's time for folks to pay their fair share. Whatever fair is, it's somehow to be more taxes than what rich people are currently paying. And, and then other people say, well, they could afford it. It won't hurt him. But the Bible does not reflect this kind of thinking. Nor there's no suggestion that government has the right to take money from wealthy people simply because they're wealthy, just to use an example. The emphasis in the Bible is on treating rich and poor fairly and justly. I mean, if somebody's done wrong, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you're penalized. But if you have not done wrong, you shouldn't be punished. So the question is not whether someone is rich or poor, but whether someone has done good or evil. And it's wrong. Scripture reinforces that it's wrong to punish those who have not done evil. Proverbs 17:26 says, to impose a fine on a righteous man is not good. And this is also consistent with what the Bible teaches about the proper role of government, to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. 1 Peter 2:14. So my point is that, trying to exploit, as we recently heard, this idea of paying your fair share. Well, look you guys know as I do, there's many Christian people in our Christian circles and non-Christian that are wealthy. You can name them, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett. Look at the incredible good these guys have done. They've given a lot of their wealth away, doing good for other people. And there's a lot of wealthy people of high integrity. Of course, there's wealthy people that are not of high integrity, just like there is poor people of not high integrity. So that popped in my mind because I recently heard that argument and got an email about it during the week. But in a free society, government confiscation of wealth is just not right. And
that's right, John. And it's called, one of my favorite authors calls it the politics of guilt and pity. And what they do is, and this is exactly what the president's doing, is exactly what the Congress often does, is that they say, well, your fair share, you're not paying enough, even though 2% of the people are paying 50% of the taxes, 50% of the people aren't paying any taxes. Even in light of that, they want more. Well, the issue is what is right and what is wrong. And it's not a matter of guilting people into paying for people who are poor. If you have people who really have needs, throughout the history of America, America had a way of dealing with that. It's called private charity. And the tragedy of American compassion, in a book by Marvin Olasky, he points out that our greatest destruction of American prosperity took place by the time we reached the 1930s. The Americans had given up on the idea that it was their job to take care of the poor locally and to take care of the needy and to set up places for the unwed mothers. And we gave over the conception of charity, began to give it over to the government. And this whole idea of Social Security, the whole idea of who's going to take care of Grandma, what's going to happen to Grandma? Well, Grandma ought to be living with you. Grandma ought to be taken care of by the family and by the church. And, in fact, that's what happened for 350 years. The church, and in love, would reach out in charity. The word charity means love. It's not love to give somebody a welfare check and then send some agent to come visit them once every 6 months to see if they're on drugs or not. No, real love is to care for that individual and to help them get out of the situation that they're in. And if they're really in need, like widows and orphans, we care for them. There would be enough money to do that easily if we simply broke up the tax structure and gave to private charity the role of taking care of the people that are truly needy in America.
Well, that's absolutely true, because if you look at your two scenarios, when a person is I'll call it financially independent of all those pressures, whether it be debt or the state, there's a freedom there that drives the entrepreneurial spirit. And the entrepreneurial spirit is a risk taker. They take risks to build businesses, and some fail and some succeed. When they succeed, of course, they prosper many people because the finances are there and the capital is there to make it. On the reverse side of that, when you look at what happens under some of these statist systems, Cuba is an example where you get 1 chicken and 20 pounds of rice per month. You're living in a sense of abject poverty and slavery, so you hold everything you have because you're in fear that you will not have enough tomorrow to even feed yourself. And these are these two diametrically opposed paths that cultures go down. They either choose the one path of self-governing, and you don't covet your neighbor's property, you don't steal your neighbor's home, you don't do that. You actually care about your neighbor enough to try to help him protect what's his, and that's where you gather a nation of people who think, I'm going to protect my neighbor's stuff as well as my own, because we work together. It's very difficult to stand at the end of your driveway with your shotgun protecting your property all day and night. That's why you have laws to control the mob or anarchy. And when you see that kind of freedom start to be birthed, where people can be free and be entrepreneurial, you see great ideas, you birth of economics, you see freedom to try more things. But as you take that all away and you create that poverty enslavement and that fear and holding, you'll see less and less economic activity. The 2008 recession was a perfect example. All the money went to the sidelines and just waited to see what government was going to do. That, well, what's going to be seized next? Is it GM? Or is it the banks? Or what's after that? And that doesn't prosper a culture, nor does it prosper people. And I mean prosper them spiritually as well as physically.
Exactly. And, you know, if you just took the type of taxes that we have, you know, income tax, which is really a tribute kind of tax, property tax, and inheritance tax. I know, Marshall, I've heard you talk about this. Nowhere in the Bible does it allow the fruit of a man's lifelong labor, his work, to be taken from him after he dies and before his children, before his heirs receive it. And the biblical taxes, the only taxes that I find that are what I call biblical taxes in the Bible, is there was a head tax, a poll tax, if you will, the biblical taxes, the only taxes that I find that are what I call biblical taxes in the Bible, is there was a head tax, a poll tax, if you will, but it was it was a small tax, so the poor would not be oppressed by paying it, and then the tithe, which was a 10% tax. Well, how do we get back to that, guys? I mean, to me, it would seem that unless the people that run our government examine the proper function of government, the enumerated powers, and the improper function of government, and then all the bad programs that fall under the improper function of government, and either, you know, privatize them, like you said, Dan, or abolish those bad programs, reduce the spending, and then states have to reinstitute states' rights. I don't know of any other way to really get this done, because if you don't reduce the spending, on the other side of it, the taxation, with all this spending, that's why the taxation keeps increasing.
Well, I think you got to start at your kitchen table and make a couple of assumptions. Number one, I would say that the current way we operate can't work on forever. We can't spend, and run the debt up. So eventually, the very programs we're spending on won't function. They just won't be there. So the first thing I would say is you have to go back to your kitchen table and you have to ask those fundamental questions of your own family. How are we going to take care of mom and dad? How are we going to get out of debt? In other words, you got to start with what's in your own control, and start to have a battle plan for that. And then the next piece of it is you have to act outwardly in the culture to make changes, as you were talking about, that to rein in government, to begin to address programs where, we talk about honoring contracts. There are contracts out there for programs where people now have become dependent on it. So you have to have a battle plan to how you're going to close up that contract and not damage people, talking in contract language. So you've got these two arms. You got the one you're going to do at home and start to change the way you start the heart of man first and how your own home operates. Then two, you're going to step out into the culture and start to reduce government, starting at the federal level and then bringing it to the state level and bringing it, as I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago, to literally your local townships, where you really are self-governing entities that manage your own internal affairs.
Mm.
When you think about how we're going to bring this about, are we talking theory here? How could America, who has become a national welfare state, basically, how could we ever get back to a place where we have free enterprise entrepreneurship actually being the center focus and people being cared for out of love? That would be a Christian society. How do we get there? Well, number one, it's not just going to be because we elect people of a different political stripe. Atlas Shrugged is a movie that's out right now that everybody is watching, and of course it's the famous book by Ayn Rand, an anti-communist lady from Eastern Europe back in the 1930s. But this is very important because it points out how the government regulators and the government's power is taking our wealth and taking and destroying the free enterprise entrepreneurship of America. But the problem with Atlas Shrugged and the philosophy of it is that it is not biblically based. And when I say, why is that so important? Because people in our society, voluntarily, not in a way in which we're trying to divide the country into a civil war, but in a way in which we're trying to go back in our own lives, like Dan was saying, and live out principles that we know that are eternal. George Washington would say, if he was alive today, he would say that the answer to America's problems is to go back to the eternal rules of right. There are eternal rules of right. We don't base it upon some movie like Atlas Shrugged or some philosophy that I have my land, get off my land, kind of a selfish, I want my money, get away from me. If that's the attitude of the people who do have wealth, then obviously it gives an open door for the socialists and communists to come in and say, oh, look at those dirty rich, right? But if we are living by biblical principles and really living out our faith, and we're saying we're living by these principles because they are eternal, then we truly are willing to die for them. We're dying for them, and we're doing so first by giving to our neighbor and loving and being kind and doing all the things and adopting children and so that we don't have aborted babies. All these things that need to be done are being done by the church. That's what should be happening. And as we begin to do that from the inside out, then America will be transformed, and people will be elected who are standing on these eternal principles of right. And the Constitution, for example, which has been totally forgotten for the last 50 years in our country. But not until we get back to these eternal principles are we going to have the spiritual and political will to deal with our destruction of ourselves and our society, which is going on right now.
And Marshall, don't you have to couple that with a longer view? I mean, some people are saying, well, how would I solve this tomorrow? I mean, I have my house mortgage, and I've got other financial difficulties that are out there. And all I can say is this: you have to have a long view. You have to look at it as, okay, I can't solve it all in my generation, me, but I can prepare things so the next generation is better able to start out without debt. Maybe you build some finances to help your son buy a piece of land and build a house and start out without debt when he and his wife get started. You start to look beyond your current situation, and you resolve that over time, but you start having a vision out there in the future that the next generation will have a different start than you did. You have to be able to look back and understand where you made mistakes and figure out how you're going to change the next generation. I mean, I know my wife and I have been talking about literally building the house for my son, actually build his house for him. In other words, go with a physical hammer and nails and set him up so he starts out with no debt.
Well, as we see, guys, the liberty has never appeared on the face of this earth without meeting enemies to contend with. But the good news, and we're winding up today's program, is that the gospel will bring changed lives. And Christ desires that this will result in changed families, changed neighborhoods, schools, and business. Good evening. Thank you for joining us with the Story of Liberty. We'll be back next week with Marshall and Dan. I'm your host, John Bona. Have a blessed evening. God bless you.